Welcome to this Line of Blood deep dive episode. I am so excited to have with me today Mark, a retired NYPD detective who we know in the story as Mark the Cop. It's nice to see your face. You're much grayer than the last time I saw you, as am I.
That's it's a combination of factors, as you know.
I can't believe it's been 10 years. Like, as I've been putting the videos together that are on the website, I'm just like, this was friggin' 10 years ago. I don't know where that time went. It's
Me
crazy.
neither. Me neither. But here we are, still talking about
Why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and your experience?
it. Okay, so let's see. It goes back a long way. That's why I'll have all this gray hair. So the started, back with the NYPD back in the late '80s, and police officer and detective there, and a lot of varied experience there. Obviously everyone starts a patrol. Moved on into different investigative roles. Narcotics, forensics, fugitive enforcement, and did a 20-year career there. Was in the reserves and military for a while, and then became a civilian contractor for the military when I retired. Did that for 3 years and did investigative support of their operations overseas. And then moved into tech, but again, the tech side for law enforcement support. So pretty much my whole life has been in some kind of law enforcement or military capacity for the most part.
You've done a lot of really interesting stuff, but I think what's interesting in terms of, you getting involved in Line of Blood is that you did do a lot of really interesting work in Brooklyn. You were undercover, right? And then you were a detective as well. So that was really your turf for a while, right?
And that's how I got promoted. So I started on patrol in Brownsville and East New York as well, because they used to send us over to East New York and Crown Heights and Bed-Stuy. So started there. When I went into narcotics, I also ended up in Brooklyn North. So my first 6 months as an undercover was in East New York. And
Mm.
we moved to all those same places I just mentioned with the inclusion of Bushwick and Williamsburg as well back then. And I was undercover for about 2 years, in narcotics about six and a half, again, all in those same areas. In forensics for 9 years. So that was kind of a foray out of Brooklyn. So I used to handle all the shooting cases for Manhattan, but Brooklyn used to have so many that, I used to back up Brooklyn as well.
You must
And
have seen some crazy ass shit during those days for sure.
well, if you recall any New York City history, you also know that those days were the highest crime days New York City had ever seen in its history. And when
Now,
I
are you
say
talking about the 80s? Are you talking about the early 80s?
'80s up through like the early '90s, mid '90s, when Giuliani became mayor. No politics, but just his policies, which was really Bratton's policies, kind of changed what we saw. A good economy didn't hurt either. So it went from probably me working in the most dangerous city to years after I retired being one of the top 10 safest cities in America.
Yeah, it's crazy how the city changed. It was amazing.
Yeah, I mean, you could take the subway in the mid morning hours and not have an issue. And I remember back when I was young, growing up, '70s, '80s, you wouldn't take the subway unless it was rush hour. So it changed, significant change. So yeah.
Oh Lord, those were the days. So with all your experience and knowledge of Brooklyn,
Well,
I
I
know
also grew up there, so don't forget that aspect of it.
you also grew
My
up
family's
there.
from Cobble Hill, and I grew up in Gravesend, tail end of Bensonhurst, Bath Beach. So really, good part of my life was spent there in different ways, but certainly a long period of time.
Now, I know you're someone who's always been really interested in New York history and mob history and all that good stuff, but I wanted to hear from you why you agreed to help me try to find some facts around Uncle Abe's death with a case that was so old. Um, what interested you in it that you initially agreed to help me? Or was it
Well,
just because
of
you were a
course,
good friend?
let's start. Well, it's a short list, but it's quite a list also. So it depends on how you look at it. So of course, obviously, because we're friends, and this was something you were looking to dig yourself into, and I was like, it's too cool. First as a friend, and I've seen your other various projects over the years, so obviously I couldn't be overly helpful with those. So this was a cool opportunity to kind of give you some firsthand help, I was hoping, but also the fact that I kind of have always had like this. It's not simply with traditional organized crime, but like when I get interested in something, so you mentioned history. from history, but also like always been interested in true crime and crime organizations. So when I say that, we're not just talking about traditional, let's say, what they would call Italian organized crime, but also, outlaw motorcycle gangs and other types of gangs. And so I've always kind of been interested, even going back to the book on the, about the 1800s, the gangs in New York, which is really a
Yeah.
sociological book. It's not really what the movie was. So, when you do it that way, it gives you this really long history, of unfortunately the worst elements. But of course, the worst elements are something that Americans and I think worldwide people are always enamored with. Every show is about police or bad guys or something like that. And I don't think that's changed from Western outlaws to
No,
now.
it's gotten more intense, don't you think?
There's more content out there, more people willing to produce
Absolutely.
content. So any good story like yours, which I'm hoping that's where ultimately this goes. So Scorsese, if you're out there, please pick up on this and listen to the podcast.
So tell me what stands out the most to you about looking back on this case. I mean, I can't believe it's been 10 years since we were actually on the ground in Brooklyn. 10 years this year.
Well, I mean, the story, and it doesn't surprise me at all. To be fair with you, one of the things about the story I found interesting from the beginning is that given, again, Hollywood's and the public's appetite for traditional organized crime, how come the first time I ever heard this was from you? Like, how come no book? I mean, I've heard of other, Jewish organized crime members through all of this history, but why would a guy as big as your uncle, like, no one heard about at all? I found
Well,
it very,
that's the point. I mean, those records were gone.
but I
Every
don't just
day
mean
through
from the reporting
history.
perspective. I just mean in general. Like,
Oh, well, exactly.
someone would want that story.
I've only found him mentioned in one book ever, and it was only a paragraph. But I think it's because people 75 years later have no idea this happened because there are no records. And unless you know the day that Abe died and you looked it up in the New York Times, you wouldn't have known it happened.
Right, right. And I'm going to say to you this as well. Do you think there is anybody else in organized crime whose homicides are unknown to anyone?
Of course.
Yeah. So I
Of
mean,
course.
we take it as a one-off, like, and it's this big thing. So I think what surprised me is again, this is a good story. So from the fact that it was a good story, how come you're still digging so hard to uncover it, right? And then the second part of it is, even for me, I think I was a little surprised at the lack of any documentation whatsoever. Period. Nothing. Like, it was almost as if when this all began, he was going to be an informant. And I can see pulling files, because again, it's just physical files back in those days. Everything's paper, all being pulled and picturing it in my head, all being put in boxes, right? Because that's exactly how it was done, even in my day, right? And then deciding that box has got to go. Because
Mm.
again, it gives an avenue of information that someone may pique their curiosity and decide we want to look into this. So if there's nothing to go on, as you found here, and you uncovered everything that you possibly could, especially given the age of the case, that to me was very surprising that there was literally nothing, not even an editorial thing, like by someone saying that there had an opinion about what might have happened to him.
Oh, that's true. I mean, the police at their press conferences fed the press. And
Yeah.
so the press was only reporting what the police told them to report, except for this one guy named Arnold Prince who wrote for the Daily Mirror, which of course no, well, hasn't existed since back then. And he wrote really interesting kind of biographical pieces about Abe's life and who he was for almost 10 days straight. Every day he had a new article on Abe. But other than that, it was basically just what the police told them to report. And the only documentation we ever really got was the ME's report, which was incredibly lacking in information, and his death certificate. Other than that, it was only newspaper articles.
Well, I mean, again, it wouldn't be the first time there's been a story out there where even up to the medical examiner, the information is given as you want the story to be, not as the story.
Exactly, exactly.
And that's also not a surprise. And again, I'm not saying something out of turn, You could be purposefully evasive, like, or, leave things out, and it wouldn't be the first
Absolutely.
time it happened. So, again, it speaks. What I find interesting, though, is what you just said, because I don't know if we ever talked about that before. This, you said it was the Daily Mirror,
Hmm.
the writer.
Hmm.
Okay. Why him? Why did he and no one else? Did he not fear it? Was
And
it,
he
or,
actually had a byline, Arnold Prince.
but I find it interesting, like,
Hmm.
why him where the others were silent? Why did he feel like it was okay writing this? Unless what he wrote was basically benign, but again, you would think that controlling the press from city, I'm just going to call it city politics, because it's
Hmm.
city politics in general. All these entities, separating them is I think it's important for people to know. It's like it's all together from the mayor on down. Everybody knows what's going on. Like I
Hmm.
said, a lot of these top positions have been appointed. You didn't work your way up necessarily at the final. Like, again, police commissioner, or even if you're the chief of department, you're the chief of detectives. They're appointed. They're not elected. So you put in your pieces for the best chess game you're going to play.
Hmm. Well, but what was interesting about Arnold Prince's articles was that they were very sort of uh pulp fictiony. It's like Abe Babchick with a cigarette hanging from his lips would gamble $100,000 a night and win 200,000 back. And it was those kinds of stories, like how he dressed and where
All
he hung
right, so
out,
so
and
I'm
it
gonna
was
so I'm
very
gonna
pulpy.
I'm gonna 180 this then.
Hmm.
So again, like, go back to The Godfather. The
Hmm.
newspaper may like a story like that,
Hmm.
right? So what if he was one that was easy to create these, as you put it, pulp fiction type that would be very
Very
real?
guys and dollsy, yeah.
But what does it also do? It makes people go, oh, he was caught up in the rackets and got what was coming to him, to quote the same scene from The Godfather.
Mm.
So it's I have no sympathy. Well, he knew what he was getting into. Like, maybe he was just getting robbed of some winnings. Who knows? The
Mm.
rest of it doesn't follow, but you know how the public is. Like, they like a good story and then they move on to the next good story.
Yeah.
No one's looking. If no one's looking, there's nothing to uncover.
Crazy. And then, of course, we've got Uncle Frankie, who no death certificate, no body, no nothing.
And that was the next thing that I was going to say when you asked me what stood out in my mind. So one is, even for me, the lack of anything to find was is even I still can't believe it. And then even more so for like nothing. Really, there's nothing on Frankie. Like, just nothing. Like, it. Then did someone purposely help you evaporate? Because that's very hard for someone to do on their own.
Well, and what
It's
was
something.
interesting was that, I mean, I think one of the issues too was that the family name was spelled differently a lot of times. But when I did finally find that strange surrogate court report on Uncle Frankie, where they were trying to disperse my great grandmother's will, and they had to hire a special guardian of the court in 1953 to see if they could actually find Frankie because no one had seen him since
Right.
46.
It's
And
an order
and
to determine heirs.
yes. And so what was so fascinating about that was it gave me all this information I would have never been able to find elsewhere. But the special guardian, who did a very thorough job, wrote to the FBI, and the FBI wrote back some agent saying, we're not allowed to give out that information.
I find it
But then
interesting.
she tried again. And the second time, J. Edgar Hoover wrote back. And I have the letter with his signature that says, we want you to know that we have done our best to try to accommodate you, but we have no information. So he was
That's
kind
the
of
answer I
shutting it
expected the
down.
first. That was the answer I expected the first time.
Mhm.
And interesting that someone as high as him. That means, so I take it from what I know. I can't speak to the FBI, but I can speak to like an NYPD thing, right? So for it to get that high up the food chain to the highest level
Mhm.
means that whoever got it asked his boss, who asked his boss, who
Mhm.
asked his. So if there's nothing, then the first person can tell you there's nothing,
Mhm.
right? Well,
Exactly. It's totally fishy.
maybe the second person could tell you there's nothing, but really all the way that high, like,
Mhm.
I question his involvement. Period.
Exactly. It all ties back to Murder Inc. The whole thing. The whole thing.
Well, because remember, even if you were a law and order guy and you didn't take the money or you weren't doing anything like that, but a lot of these guys are very career oriented, right? So I don't see what I don't see. So I'm going to focus on what I do to get my career forward. So the successes that I can have, I will. But I'm not going to tangle myself in these complicated webs, which could potentially take me down, because that'll be a failure in my career as a civil servant. I just want to
Mhm,
look good and do
mhm,
this and move up. So
mhm,
you never did anything wrong. The only thing you did wrong was maybe look the other way or determine that wasn't going to be something we look into, because I know why, and I'm not going to have that blow back on me.
mhm. Yeah, it was interesting that the first letter basically said, "I can't tell you,"
I can't believe the
and
word.
then they had to shut it down with, "We don't have anything."
Yeah, because if I say that, it means I have something. I just can't tell you. And again, I
I
don't
know,
think there was
right?
legitimate witness protection back then. I don't think there
Mhm.
was. But if you don't see any prosecution trail, like in other words, let's say Frankie did cooperate, and that's how why he disappeared. Let's just say, let's use that as a potential. There's nothing from a prosecutorial perspective to show that any of the people involved, like where the information came from, and given that at that level, for them to be able to get rid of records there too. So at some level there had to be some records, because it's, again, you asking for them is different potentially than a lawyer asking for them. But I forget the name of the law. The law might not have existed then, but like after 10 years, they have to turn it over. So there's been a lot of really good journalists, authors, investigative journalists.
Are you talking about the FBI?
Yeah, I'm talking about from the federal records. Like there's
Mhm.
there's a, there's an amount of years. It's can't remember the name of the law. Like for some reason, I'm thinking it's a beach in Florida, but it's not. But that law means that after so many years, they have to release information.
Yeah,
That being,
but it's funny. I mean, I got Abe Rellis's FBI file, and most of it was completely redacted.
right.
So much for the Freedom of Information Act.
Or there's what's not in there. You don't know if it's in there or not. And so I will speak from my own history. I won't get into the details. I'll just say I was in a circumstance in the police department where I was allowed. My attorney said, "You're because of what's going on. This is your one chance to look at your personnel record, your real personnel record that's in the basement of one police plaza." So I says, "Well, I don't care. It doesn't matter to me." He goes, "No, I would if I were you, I would go and look, because you won't get another chance." This is towards the end of my career. So I said, "Okay." So go make an appointment, go there, show up, go down to this sub basement. It's a countered room, and you tell them what you're there for, and they say, "Okay, wait over there." And it's kind of like going to a bank safe deposit box area, like where so you can look at it privately, right? And they bring me a folder, so I can tell right away as soon as they put the folder down that it's one of those expansion folders,
Mm.
that it was a hell of a lot more expanded than the amount of documents that were actually in there. And when I started looking through them, it was all benign documents, like you
Mm.
called in sick in 1989. You requested a transfer. Like it was all benign documents.
Oh, well, that's good.
Well, it's good if that's all that was there,
Mm.
because I
Oh,
already
so you're
know.
saying stuff was taken out.
What
Yeah.
I'm saying, I know for a fact there was investigative documents. Like, and
Mm.
I know investigation in one case, so a different situation, went on for a year and a half, and I didn't know it. So where is all that stuff? Where's the transcript? I mean, I was what we call a GL-15, which just basically means that it's a recorded conversation with you and like some internal affairs people, and you are only required to answer questions that are specifically and now related to the duties and responsibilities of that incident. They're not allowed to ask you anything outside that scope. But I know that I've done this more than one time in my police career. Where was all that?
Hmm.
Where's the transcripts of that?
Hmm.
Where is the reporting by the internal affairs people who would have written that? And I'm only using this not to talk about myself, but just so it's apparent.
Yeah, yeah.
So we're talking about, this is the 2000s. Okay,
Hmm.
this is probably, I want to say, '06. So when you talk about what could have gone on in the 30s,
Yeah, forget about it, right?
so I'm just saying it's not something new, and
And
it's not
it's
something
interesting.
that's gone away.
And it's interesting because Detective Strafford of the Cold Case Squad, who was a lovely gentleman and was tried to be very helpful to me and always took the time to talk to me, he told me that he had requested, I think, 10 case files in a 12-month period and only gotten back two,
Hmm.
and said that there was only like one person who went to a warehouse in Queens or Long Island to
Basically,
find
it's
records. Like there didn't seem to
Harlem
be
City.
any support around actually helping with cold cases with the NYPD. It
Yeah,
was interesting.
yeah, and I mean, and so the same limitation exists, right?
Mhm.
You know, again, if in fact, I mean, if something's not there, it's not there. You can't make it be there. You know, whether it's destroyed, whether it's been taken purposefully or otherwise,
Yeah, but we don't
misfired.
even know if they looked at that point. So,
Well, it's true, but what I'm saying, it's not the first time I've heard that. That was difficult because I had another friend of mine who was an old timer. When I had asked him about that too, had he had a connection where he could help me get in there and take a look at old records. And that's how I got in there. But he told me too up front. I don't know if I told you this during the process, but he told me, he's like, good luck, but I really doubt you're going to like find anything.
with Frankie, again, I felt lucky to have found the few newspaper articles that I did that corroborated that he actually was arrested for running Abe's lottery, trying to find Abe's killer, and then got sent to Sing Sing for 2.5, 3 years, and then seems to have disappeared when he came out. So
Did we talk about this in the past? I think we did, and you couldn't find anything there either. Were there any prison records of visitors?
I could not find any. There is a Sing Sing database,
Yeah.
and there was nothing listed under his name, which
Yeah, but you
means
don't know how far back, because even when I was
true.
doing data for the NYPD, like what was dumped in, we'll just call it virtually, because that people identify with now. Like if you wanted something before '87, it was a different system to
Mhm.
try to find anything. So realistically, it may not be because um, there isn't anything. It may be because the public facing ability to do that through a computer just doesn't exist. They may not tell you that, but it would be interesting to know, do like the visitor logs,
But let me ask you this. Let's say some official went to go visit him.
right?
He would probably have taken his name or made sure his name was not in the log,
I
right?
doubt if he's an official. I doubt his. Like
Mhm.
I don't think anybody. If he says I'm not signing the book, no one's stopping him.
Mhm.
That no one's stopping him. But it would still be interesting for the people who did sign. I don't know why I didn't think of this a long time ago, but
I'm going to take a note and write that down. Yes, we're still digging for stuff once in a while
I,
here.
I can't believe I didn't think of that at another time during this conversation. Maybe it's because I kind of was so focused on Abe. I think I forgot that he was incarcerated after the fact.
Well, I mean, we did try to find some arrest records for Frankie, and and that was the other thing. It's like the newspapers would print their arrest records, but then when we went to go look for them, we couldn't find them.
Yeah. Well, like I said, none of that surprises me, given the age of this. Keeping it around Abe's murder, right? So if we kind of have this inkling that he might have now decided to be an informant, right? Because you don't know in the background, since you couldn't interview anybody from back then, if he was feeling threatened now, not simply his business, but personally, and
Mhm.
his family and things like that. And so that's typically the kind of pressure necessary to get someone to cooperate, right? But if you're going to cooperate now, and the entities within law enforcement and the legal community, like the district attorney's office, have something to lose. Because again, I'm not speaking out of turn when I turn around and say we all know that
Mhm.
there was payoffs, and they were regular payoffs. It wasn't like payoff for one-off things. Or I can tell you an interesting story from my friend's book on the side if you want. But these were regular payments
Yeah, yeah.
for basically organized criminals to do business. And
Mhm.
we know back in that day, and The Godfather touches on it, right? Like gambling and prostitution are harmless vices, but if we get into the drug business, it's a dirty business, right?
Mhm.
So back then, everybody kind of went along because it's what people wanted. So nobody was really enforcing anything related. But if you were going to bring down the house of cards by turning around and informing on people who he had books that showed payments that we know disappeared, to who, and they found out that he had those kind of records, and a guy in that kind of business would, right? Because that's leverage in the future.
And all the way up the food chain.
All the way up,
All the way up the
exactly.
food
And
chain.
it's no surprise because it's no different in the layers of how an organized crime family works. And I like to use the movie The Godfather because it was one of the first significant movies like I think the American public saw about this type of organized crime. But when Willie Chi-Chi is testifying, right, and he's talking about the family's got a lot of buffers because he never got an order to kill anyone directly from the head of the family, because that's not how it works. So
Mm-hmm.
it's the same thing with these payoffs, right? There's a guy who goes around, whether he's from the patrol guy or whether it's the detective, who goes around and picks up all the money and brings it back, and it goes, like you said, up the chain. So realistically, no one's tied directly. But this was a scary thing, and there's been many commissions. One's even in my time with the just before I got on with the Buddy Boys in the 7-7 and the Mullen Commission in the 7-3, where I work with the Morgue Boys.
Mm-hmm.
Like it. So when I say these things, there is nothing. It's just been going on for as long as there's been people of power and people who can control the power by controlling who's in the police department and the DA's office, or the DA's office controlling whatever it is, whatever the power structure is, where you have the ability to profit from it, and you go into a culture where that's just how it is.
Mm-hmm.
You know, again, I don't want to keep using movies, but it's something I think people can identify with. Is Serpico,
Sure.
right? He just didn't want to take the money. Wasn't going to inform on anybody, allegedly. Again, the story being told how it is. Um, but they didn't trust him now.
Mm-hmm.
And then they attempt to take his life. So do you think there's a parallel between him and your uncle to some extent? Your uncle had a big business. There's probably other people looking at that business and saying, like, who's this guy to have that size of business? We want to take that over. It's a common move, right? It's like a merger and
Well,
acquisition, except we're
well,
killing people.
as we talk about in the podcast, there were all those theories about the murder, and one of them was that a rival gang rubbed him out. But I think, at this point,
I say it's too coincidental. They could have done that at any time when
they
he
could
got
have
there.
done it at any time. And at this point, it really is about the connection between his death and then Abe Kid Twist Relis's death 7 weeks
Right.
later.
Right,
Um,
and nobody can prove it, right? But it's been talked about again outside of me. I'm not giving you my opinion like it's an epiphany. It's been talked about forever. What was the name of it? The Half Moon Motel or the Half
Half
Moon?
Moon Hotel, yeah.
And he goes out the window. Like, was he escaping or was he thrown? We'll never know, right? But we find it interesting that he's going to be an informant, but he's being protected by the police and or DAs. I forget
It's
exactly
the
what.
DA's office, yeah.
Yes, the DA's
It was
investigation.
all the DA's office. They were so.
So isn't that but it's interesting, right? Like, so that's the way we can say it, but most of us are logical people, right? And if you follow the KISS method, you just keep it simple.
But you see, what there was, there was so much going on in New York in terms of cops
Yeah,
and crime in the 30s. Like literally, if you read the paper, every single day there was a new story, something was going on. Like it was crazy making.
think
But
of
what
think
we
of this.
also had going on was John Harlan Amen had his big corruption investigation going on about Brooklyn authorities. And so you've got him over here doing that. You've got the DA's office over here doing all of their stuff. And what's interesting to me is that, John Harlan Amen needed my uncle to be, Amen needed Uncle Abe and Abe Kid Twistrellis to be his key witnesses in his corruption case against the DA's office and the cops on the take. And he was negotiating with Uncle Abe's lawyer, but supposedly there was something that was too extreme for him to negotiate. And I wonder if that had to do with witness protection because there really was no witness protection back then. That
I
didn't
don't.
come
I
into
don't
being
believe there
in the
were. I
70s.
don't believe there was. No.
Yeah, so I mean, you've got Relis at the Half Moon Hotel under police guard as a guarded witness. But if somebody like Abe came to Amen and said, I need you to protect my family, there
But
really wasn't
yeah,
anything
so it's
then, was
interesting you
there?
say that from a witness protection standpoint because I could be wrong about this without researching it, but I think that's only really at the federal level, and I don't think there was any RICO laws yet,
Mm.
folks. Which
Yeah, I
would
think it wasn't until the 70s that that
right,
became
right,
official.
exactly when they needed. So I don't even know what pro- witness protection meant, other than you go into a motel and being told you got to stay in the motel room. That was about it. And the PS to that story. So it's
So how did people ever have the guts to actually testify against bigwigs? I guess they didn't. They were
Between a
terrified.
lot
That's why my
of,
family never said anything, right?
I
That's
mean,
why there was that code of silence. They were terrified.
well, right. You're terrified for your family, for yourself, and like, what are the two ways that you can go? Like, you still have that information, so you're always going to be a threat, even if you hand your business over.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't matter. Yep, take it. I'm good. Like I'm fine. I have enough money to disappear. They're never going to trust that you're actually going to disappear,
Mm-hmm.
especially if you're not going to turn over the books that are the log books that are showing, or the accounting ledgers that are showing who all the payments went to over the years. I mean, it's pretty depth of investigation is deep. And who was you tell me who was doing it in the first place? Like who was actually investigating it? It was just such a commonplace thing. I think it's interesting if you consider a group that had the name Murder Incorporated, and that was just like accepted by people to read in the newspaper. Oh, murder! Like,
Well, the press named them that.
say again?
The
No,
press
but
named them
what I'm
that.
saying is like, so if we name them that and
Yeah.
we have the
Mm-hmm.
people identified, like, why aren't all efforts on, like, just from a law and order perspective?
Mm-hmm.
Like if I was really a law and order mayor who has a law and order DA and I appoint the police commissioner, so I should have a law and order police commissioner. Like, shouldn't we, like, we can't have something out there that people are calling Murder Incorporated. That's not good for us.
Well, and that was O'Dwyer's whole campaign strategy to get into the DA's office was he said he'd take down the Brownsville boys who later became Murder Inc.
Well,
Yeah, that was his
politicians
election
use a lot of
promise.
platforms to get elected, don't they?
I'm sorry, say that again.
It says politicians use a lot of platforms to get themselves elected. And how
They
many of them actually see those through?
so on the ground in Brooklyn, tell me what was it like for you to when Maria the psychic joined us? What was it like for you to have the experience working with the crime scene psychic? Was that a first time for you? And what were your thoughts on that?
Certainly was the first time for me. I'm not even sure if the NYPD has done that very much. And I think, like anyone in law enforcement, like I think we're like cynical about all that kind of stuff, and we're just like, yeah, okay, sure. Um, but I'll go along with it because in this case, I mean, again, or even if honestly, even if it was someone who was assigned to me for a real case, I would still go along with it because you never know what information you're going to get. You don't know what the thing is that's going to ping. Like, and again, in this case, that's kind of what happened, right? So I was not really, I don't have any belief in that. So I was going along with it because I also
You were
recognize.
very open to the situation, which I
Yeah,
appreciated.
of
Yeah.
course, yeah, of course. But what I mean is, like, I think what was interesting about it, I think even for yourself, having felt like you've exhausted almost every other avenue you possibly could, that you were going to open this door to, because again, like I would feel about it, hey, I may find out nothing, but who knows that one little shred of something, I don't know. Like I said, I don't believe in this, but I'm going to go along with it. And initially, I, I was still like, I found it interesting, because she, again, as you have in the book, she was feeling and talking about a lot of things that our understanding is she could possibly have no prior knowledge of,
Mhm.
up to and including New York City at all, or Brooklyn, or street names,
Mhm.
or anything, right? Or describing anything. I mean, it would be impossible even if she was that slick, I think. Like, what was
There
she
was
going to do?
no way. There was
Like,
no
what are you going
way.
to do? Walk the
Yeah.
Google guy around? Like, it just doesn't work that way, right?
Well, she didn't have any information. She didn't want
Right.
any information.
Right, and so that's I certainly found it interesting. I have no explanation for it one way. I'm not going to attempt to, but when I, of course, found it more interesting, right, is she's describing something, and I in my mind I'm picturing that I know where this is, but I'm not going to be like, oh, let me show my hand. Oh, do you think it looks like this? And I'm not going to do anything. Like, I'm just going to be like, okay, I'll just point the car in that direction and I'll just start driving and see what happens. And we'll do a little bit more Q&A and see what happens. And that's why I initially passed the street and didn't go directly to it. And,
Mhm.
and then came around from the other side because I
Mhm.
wanted to see if, in fact, when I was passing exactly where I wanted to pass, but
Mhm.
from the avenue, not the street
Mhm.
itself,
Mhm.
would there be this sudden vision from her that, oh my God, like we're here, or it's right around here. Even I would have been good with that. And then that's why I came around onto the street. And that's why I had to go the wrong way because,
So let me just say for people who may not know what we're talking about, this was the day in Brooklyn when Maria felt that she had seen where Abe was taken to be murdered. This was not in any of the recorded newspaper articles that he was murdered someplace other than where his body was found. But Maria had a very clear vision of it. And you, knowing the Brooklyn terrain, you really, and cousin Michael and I were there, and we were on the edge of our seats as she was saying stuff, and you were figuring out what she was seeing. And it was kind of, it was kind of amazing.
right,
But what you're saying is you went by it to just make sure that was
right.
really,
Remember you said, like,
really
because I drove down the street the wrong way? Like, that's why I did,
Mhm.
because we were now on the other side and I wasn't going to go back around again because I know that neighborhood and it took us too long. So it was just easier to go in reverse down the street. But that's why, like I said, that's why I did it. I had that in my mind because either this is, and again, can I speak to where she gets this from? No.
Mhm.
Do I believe any more or less in it? I don't know. I mean, once you've seen too many things in your life, like, you don't disbelieve anything, but don't necessarily believe it either.
Skeptical believer. I know that's me. I've always been a skeptical believer. And I think there's a lot of people out there who are just making a dime off people. But Maria, I think, really was sort of tuned into something that I didn't understand. Um, she knew so much about this case that was not accessible online or anyplace else. I mean, the fact that she knew what Lincoln Place looked like before we went there, I had never given her the address or anything.
Right. How,
It was crazy. It was crazy.
and even if it was something that you ever even touched on or spoke about, like she would have to have like not a photographic memory, but she'd have to like remember everything and then know enough to like run on a computer and start looking things up. And in which case, she still would not have found anything regarding this case anyway.
Exactly, exactly.
So it was, and like never having been to New York before or Brooklyn before, and having this sense of directionality and where this and where that, and it's like, when she saw where Dubrov's would have been, and then across Eastern Parkway, where the gate was, that was heavily described.
Yeah,
I remembered that all of that too because I
that was
worked
crazy, that gate. I know.
there. It is, like so.
Because we Google walked Eastern Parkway, Eric, my research assistant, and I, looking for that gate, but you couldn't see it on Google Walk because it was too recessed from the street.
Right,
It
right,
wasn't
because
until
it's
we were
only a car
actually
driving
there.
by, because it's only just a car with a camera on it. Yep.
Yeah.
And there it was, so again, like skeptically believer, and I'm not going to not go with the program.
It's well, and so when she saw Abe's death under a bridge near water on a dirt road with warehouses, the place we ended up was pretty amazing
Yeah,
off of
well, I
Van
mean,
Sinderen Avenue.
because I was trying in my head to what's the closest to where we were, because there are a few other places around the city
Yeah, but
that
the
could,
elevated train as the bridge was kind of brilliant. That was brilliant.
especially because she describes like the crossover, and that's unique. Like that's not
Well,
every.
she had been told Atlantic in Pennsylvania.
Yes. Oh, that's right. Yeah, and that
And we
too.
didn't know what it was. I thought it was an ocean and a state. We were like, what? Because I'd never been to Brooklyn either, Mark. And
Yeah.
so we were kind of like, what the hell is this?
Yeah, yeah. And I knew what it was, but again, I wasn't going to show my hand to feed into it. I'd rather just, oh, okay, and I'll start driving and see what happens. So,
Deciphering the clues from Maria were pretty amazing, especially finding Van Sinderen Avenue. Yeah. Uh, that was
yeah,
fascinating. So did
that's
it change? So did it change your mind at all about possibly working with crime scene psychics?
well, I'm retired, but
Well, just, your
I
thoughts.
believe, and I'll tell you the same thing. Like, if a investigator or a detective or somebody finds themselves in a position, like in your case, you were an investigator in this case, really. The there's no other avenue, right? Like then, and this is a potential. Why wouldn't you? Like to me, you're not doing your due diligence, right? Like anything is worth it. Like doing that ridiculous. I don't know if you put this in a podcast, but I like had the metal detector, right?
Oh, on the third trip to Lincoln Place.
Right? Or, looking for a potential. I mean, no one had any expectations, but we still did it, right? Because if you didn't do it, you would have been like, well, maybe I could have.
Maria thought there was something buried on the empty lot, and you and Jared and my nephew Zach were digging through the dirt.
Right. I mean, it's the only way you can refute it is to say I went there, I looked, and I couldn't find anything. Same with going
And
down the basement. Same with going in the dumbwaiter.
And
like
God bless you for pulling out that dumbwaiter piece by piece. That
they
was
weren't
hysterical.
going to be there all day. I can tell you that. So
And that is the interesting part is that that was the one thing that Maria was more adamant than anything else in this entire journey, and we never found anything. And
but the description of the property, like we found the things that were described, regardless of finding any evidence.
exactly, I mean, cousin Jared still thinks the evidence is there, and it could be behind that false, weird over bricked wall that my sister and I found on the
Could be, but
last
it could be
trip.
the first time
But you know
somebody.
what? Until that building's coming down, actually, you know what I think? Here, people, here's my big thought on this now, is that there was dumbwaiter A and then there was dumbwaiter B. And since their headquarters were in apartment 4D, that means the B dumbwaiter would have been their dumbwaiter
How come we didn't get to that? I don't remember.
because it was behind sheetrock and we were going to have to tear
We
down an
couldn't. We would
entire
have to talk to
wall.
them.
Yeah.
Yeah, we
And
couldn't go
Jana
back.
did not have the money to rebuild a wall for the landlord. So, yeah,
Yeah. Well, let's see. What year was that?
that we were there
Yeah.
to 218, 217.
So we're in 25. Okay, so statute of limitations is over, so we're good.
Well, remember the landlord allowed us there the last time.
Yeah, no, I know. I'm just saying in general, like pulling down dumb waiters and things like that. We're
No,
good.
we had permission to be there the last time. He said, "Pull out anything you want." I just couldn't afford to rebuild a wall, so
Yeah,
Yeah, it's a mystery for the next generation. One day that building may come down and maybe Zach's kids will go and look for it. Who
we'll
knows?
go and look. But you got to keep in touch with the owners because you don't know when it'll change hands and they'll just come in and bulldoze that thing.
True.
Sure. One of the things we didn't talk about, I think, what was on your list of questions was, about these prisoners being taken out and coming to testify with, we'll just call it tailored testimony for crimes or anything like that.
Well, yeah, they'd put him up at a hotel and then they'd bring him to
Right.
court to
We didn't talk
testify.
about that. I thought that
Yeah.
was interesting because I'm not surprised it went on. I'm just surprised that um, that in this case that you even found any information that would reflect that happened. Like they
Oh,
spoke.
but it's pretty common. I mean, in a lot of the cases I researched, like the Malinsky murder trial, which for me was such a big clincher in terms of who was covering up what, it would, the detectives would get on the stand and they would say, yeah, we had Malinsky at a hotel for 8 months. He was on vacation. But then Malinsky would get on the stand and say they beat the shit out of me for 6 months and told me to say this. So that stuff is pretty common. You can find it. And in terms of Abe Rellis and the Murder Inc. guys who turned state evidence and were at the Half Moon Hotel in Coney Island, that is very well documented because the Murder Inc. investigation reports at the municipal archives, there's like 83 million boxes to
Sure.
research, and there's just tons of information. The suite, the room numbers, I mean, and everyone has been through this case for over 80 years trying to figure out, was he pushed? Did he try to escape? What really happened? But more than that, it's why. What is the real why? Is the why really to keep him from testifying against Anastasia? Is the why because the mob was trying to get rid of the last of the lower level Jewish gangsters because Murder Inc. had become a bad commodity for them to be associated with? Or was it really just a cover up for the DA? You see, because
How about all of the above?
I think it's all of the above too. But as you and I stated back in the day in Brooklyn, there was John Harlan Amen, who was getting too close to the truth.
Hmm.
And by taking out Rellis and Uncle Abe, they took out his two most important witnesses.
Yep.
There's a lot of details. And you know what? I just finished recording the Rellis deep dive episode where I really get into all of that. But yeah, I
We
think
do a
that
lot. So, like people have to understand the breadth of information they have. I mean, it's a broad spectrum of information. I mean, it's not simply about, oh, this one-off murder. Or, I mean, it's about criminal operations,
and
criminal,
everything's connected. Everything was interconnected and laced together. It's crazy.
right, with the police and the DA's office
And
and
everybody knew each other
local
and everyone would
politicians. All same thing. No, no, like I said, none of this happened in a vacuum. Every,
everybody knew each other, everybody was paying each other, everyone was lying for each other. It was crazy.
yep.
It was crazy. And that is New York in the 1930s.
and before and after. You know, the Knapp Commission happened in the early '70s. You know, with Serpico. So again, it was before, it was during, it was after, and like I said, in my time on the job, I think there was at least three major scandals.
And why do you think all that is?
It's the nature of people, and it's the nature of people who are willing to use their positions um, to benefit themselves and have no conscience about how. Uh,
Bingo.
and what
Bingo.
happens is, and to be fair, again, because I'm not going to sit here after spending so much of my life, in law enforcement or the military, it is a super small percentage.
It's not
But
everybody,
they're this,
no.
I mean, it's super small. But what they do is so damaging, and the stories are so large that you can't help if you're the average person think it must be like that for everyone. There probably was a time when it was more, but I can tell you during my 20 years, other than the scandals that I know about, and even in some cases I knew the people who
Mhm.
went, it was such a small, like nobody that I ever worked with. Like certainly I was never approached like, oh, we're like, so I never saw it. And when I found out when people got indicted or people got arrested, um, that's when you found the story out.
But
Uh,
like you were saying, one rotten egg doesn't make the whole dozen. And it's true, it's
yeah,
true.
you know.
It doesn't represent all of law enforcement, but there were time periods that were kind of dark.
Well, I mean, I don't know, can't speak for anymore, but I know when I was on, like I said, me personally, and anything I work with or people I work with, but did it go on? Of course it did. I mean, it happened while during my 20 years. So,
So is there any last thoughts, feelings, anything you want to add about this case?
no, I mean, I think,
Do you think there's still more to find, or do you think we I mean, I think we figured it out, but
I
it would be
think that
interesting.
I am again, just as, like I say, like, it's basically like a cautious optimism, like, because as your story gets out there, both from the book and the podcast, right? You don't know what tree that shakes. So you never know the low hanging fruit fall, and you don't know. There could be another little tidbit here or like even now during this doing you and I doing this Q&A right now. Again, I don't know why I didn't think of it before, but visitor logs. Do I think you're going to find visitor logs from back in those days? Probably not. But if it was something that wasn't checked, well, it's the same thing as a metal detector on a vacant lot. It's the same thing as bringing Maria on. It's the same thing. If you don't do it, then you can't say you did everything.
Exactly. And any little clue could be a big thing. You never know.
That's right.
You never know. Well, I know that I could not have proceeded forward and had the umption to get through a lot of this without your help. Like I said in the book, as stupid as it is, I did feel like you were my Hardy boy. At least I felt like I had someone to call and talk to and help me think things through, and you were absolutely invaluable. And I was so happy that you were part of this with me.
Yeah, no, it was a great thing to be a part of. I couldn't help you with vampires and other things, but I could help you with that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
I know we'll talk about it again in the future. All right.
Bye, hon.
Bye.
Thanks so much for joining us for this Line of Blood deep dive. If you want to see some behind the scenes videos or even more documentation, check out our website at lineofblood-podcast.com. There is tons of information there. Meanwhile, today we're going to call this a wrap. See you next time.